One thing you might do, Mr. Buckley, is let them vote in Mississippi.
I agree.
I was going to say, it's a very nice way of ascribing an argument that he never made that has absolutely nothing to do with what's going on to your opponent, right?
Except, lest I appear too ingratiating, which is hardly my objective here tonight, I think actually what is wrong in Mississippi, sir, is not that not enough Negroes are voting, but that too many white people are voting.
Yep, that's the moment I thought we were going to get to earlier, which is amazing. So, okay, yes. First, as you say, this attempt to turn it into a resentment thing, and also the cultural essentialism are both really on display in that earlier moment. They're saying, the problem, the thing that, the reason why so many Black people are living in poverty, it's not because of Jim Crow and redlining and etc. It's because it's because of breakdown of the family structure, which is exactly the kind of thing that you hear from contemporary conservatives. If the only thing that's remarkable about it is that it's been busted out this early, historically. But yes, that was the moment that I kind of teased on Twitter too, when Thaddeus Russell, was giving you a little bit of shit about doing this, when you were like, oh, this is still so relevant, and Russell was like, oh, are there anybody now arguing for segregation? And you're like, no, there are other things though going on in this debate that are still much more relevant. And when I sort of teased in my response to Thaddeus that actually I thought the most interesting moment in the debate wasn't about Jim Crow per se, but about what a non-racialized alternative to Jim Crow would look like, and Buckley equivocated about that. This is the moment that he's saying, "Oh, see, I'm not a racist.
I just don't want anyone to vote."
Yeah, exactly. Like what he's saying, right? Exactly what Nathan says in the chat is that we should be disenfranchising more poor people. I mean, like that's the point, right? That like he,
yeah,
that he wants. That really, that really what he's afraid of is democracy in general, right? And he doesn't want, the poorest and most beaten down people in Mississippi to vote, but he also doesn't want the second most poorest and most beaten down people in Mississippi to vote, because he's worried that any of that stuff would upset the economic apple cart.
Oh, absolutely. And I do want to say, like, that was a remarkable bit of rhetorical interplay there, where he's basically saying that Baldwin was making an argument that he never actually made in order to actually disprove a point that Baldwin never actually tried to make, right? Which is just elliptical to the umpteenth degree. But like, what I find really fascinating about this debate is that a lot of the kind of arguments that you see contemporary conservatives making seem to have had their gestation in these kind of rhetorics, right? And I anticipated this was going to happen because I've read some of Buckley's stuff before, and I knew that he had a big influence on the contemporary conservative movement. But just the weird combination of, like you said, the anti-democratic attitude with trying to portray one's adversaries as basically out of touch, snobs, and elitists, while at the same time being an out of touch snob and an elitist, right? This portrayal of conservatives as the ones who are really the victims here because their adversaries are insulated by political correctness. It's quite remarkable how this prefigured a lot of what we see today.
Yeah, right. I mean, especially because I think somebody who is busting out the contemporary equivalent of, oh, look, everybody's treating James Baldwin with kid gloves because he's Black. I think anybody busting that out today would say, oh, of course that wouldn't have been true, 50 years ago, but now. So it's remarkable to see Buckley doing the exact same move.
Yeah, absolutely.
Booker T. Washington said. Booker T. Washington said that the important thing where Negroes are concerned is not that they hold public office, but that they be prepared to hold public office. Not that they vote, but that they be prepared to vote. What are we going to do with the Negroes, having taught the Negroes in Mississippi to despise Barnett, Ross Barnett? Shall we then teach them to emulate their cousins in Harlem and adore Adam Clayton Powell, Jr.? It is much more complicated, sir, than simply the question of giving them the vote. If I were myself a constituent of the community of Mississippi at this moment, what I would do is vote to lift the standards of the vote so as to disqualify 65% of the white people who are presently voting, not simply to give the I say then that what we need is a considerable amount of practice that acknowledges that there are two sets of difficulties. The difficulties of the white person who acts as white people and brown people and black people do all over the world to protect their own vested interests, who have, as all of the races in the entire world have, and suffer from a kind of a racial narcissism which tends always to convert every contingency into such a way as to maximize their own power. That, yes, we must do. But we must also reach through to the Negro people and tell them that their best chances are in a mobile society. And the most mobile society in the world today, my friends, is the United States of America. The most mobile society of the United States in the world is the United States of America, and it is precisely that mobility which will give opportunities to the Negroes which they must be encouraged to take. But they must not, in the course of their ordeal, be encouraged to adopt the kind of cynicism, the kind of despair, the kind of iconoclasm that is urged upon them by Mr. Baldwin in his recent works. Because of one thing, I can tell you, I believe with absolute authority, that where the United States is concerned, if it ever becomes a confrontation between a continuation of our own sort of idealism, the private stock of which, granted, like most people in the world, we tend to lavish only every now and then on public enterprises, reserving it so often for our own irritations and pleasures. But the fundamental friend of the Negro people in the United States is the good nature, and is the generosity, and is the good wishes, is the decency, the fundamental decency that do lie at the reserves of the spirit of the American people. These must not be laughed at. And under no circumstances must they be laughed at, and under no circumstances must America be addressed and told that the only alternative to the status quo is to overthrow that civilization which we consider to be the faith of our fathers, the faith indeed of your fathers. This is what must animate whatever meliorism must come, because if it does finally come to a confrontation, a radical confrontation between giving up what we understand to be the best features of the American way of life, which at that level is indistinguishable, so far as I can see, from the European way of life, then we will fight the issue. And we will fight the issue not only in the Cambridge Union, but we will fight it as you were once recently called to do, on beaches and on hills and on mountains and on landing grounds. And we will be convinced that just as you won the war against a particular threat to civilization, you were nevertheless waging a war in favor of and for the benefit of Germans, your own enemies, just as we are convinced that if it should ever come to that kind of a confrontation, our own determination to win the struggle will be a determination to wage a war not only for whites, but also for Negroes.
Will the fellows take their places, please? They voted in favor of the motion being that the American dream is at the expense of the Negro. They voted in favor of that motion 544 persons and against 164 persons. The motion is therefore carried by 380 votes. I declare the House to stand adjourned.
It was a very unusual kind of argument, though, because I'm not exactly sure what Buckley was trying to claim at the end of things. I mean, he seemed to close with the argument that essentially, yeah, we've made some mistakes in the past, but we really just think they're being very mean about the way that they're expressing their points, and they should recognize the fundamental decency of a lot of the people who've been engaged in acts of oppression for a long period of time, and then we'll all be better off. And I'm not exactly sure how he thought that would be a winning claim in the 1960s at the very least.
Yeah, I think part of the problem is that what Buckley is actually defending is so bad that even by 1965, you can't quite say it plainly, and like go to Cambridge and then say it plainly. So he ends up having to get incredibly vague at the end.
Yeah.
And because if his big claim, right, like Baldwin's certainly his big claim was that the United States has treated black people terribly. That's been bad for everybody in American society. And to the extent that Buckley's claim is no, it's fine, right? Like I think that making that claim, again, like months after black people in the South are granted the right to vote, to use integrated public facilities, like that just sounds ludicrous. So he's saying these vague things about how the most openly racist part of it is, which he's, I guess, cleverly deflected by attributing it to Booker T. Washington, is this thing about how, it doesn't matter if black people can vote, it matters if they're ready to vote. And he suggests that, its question is not, should they vote, but, and of course, there's the, yes, that's right. Thomas points out in the chat, he closed by comparing civil rights activists to the Nazis, which is a bold move. But he said, he said that thing about being ready to vote, and he said, "Oh, now they can vote, or we're going to going to help them or we're going to teach them to emulate their brothers in Harlem and support Adam Clayton Powell, who I wasn't familiar with off the top of my head." So apparently, Adam Clayton Powell Jr. was a Baptist pastor and American politician who represented the Harlem neighborhood of New York City in Congress from 1945 to 1971. He was the first African American to be elected from New York to Congress, reelected for nearly 3 decades. Powell became a powerful politician, et cetera, et cetera. There's some corruption issues, but it sounds like that's stuff that happened much later. So I don't think that could be what Buckley is talking about. Says, served as a national spokesman on civil rights and social issues. He also urged United States presidents to support emerging nations in Africa and Asia as they gained independence after colonialism. As chairman of the Education and Labor Committee, he supported the passage of important social and civil rights legislations under Kennedy and Johnson. So I have to say that sounds okay to me, but there's a pretty clear suggestion there that Buckley is making, and this connects to that 1957 Unsigned National Review editorial that you quoted earlier, that somehow culturally maybe black people in the North who could vote already, right, and thus elected this black congressman from Harlem in 1945, weren't ready to vote, that they couldn't use it irresponsibly, so they elected these people who were too left wing. And of course, his big, his big defense against being a racist is that actually he's just a massive elitist who doesn't want most people to be allowed to vote.
No, absolutely. And I think this testifies to a long conservative history about being more reticent about democracy than about liberalism, right? Evan Fawcett pointed this out really well in his recent book, Conservatism, The Fight for Tradition, right? Where he said that many conservatives were willing to make peace with liberalism as long as it was interpreted in a particularly capitalistic way, right? It's essentially a system where certain people could compete and the so-called best would rise to the top, and the less effective people would lie at the bottom of the economic change. They were always a lot more reticent about democracy because democracy would, of course, empower the people at the bottom to try to make changes to that system politically, right? What really struck me about this is this antipathy towards democracy overtly, hasn't been shown for a very long time. Partly because democracy has become so deeply embedded in our cultural expectations and political institutions that it's very difficult to attack it directly. But Buckley is very overt about that, right? Where he says that, as you pointed out, right, I think the solution to people of color voting in Mississippi isn't to actually disenfranchise them. It's just to disenfranchise everybody who's too poor and too uneducated to actually participate meaningfully. So only the kind of people who will give me the results that I want will actually be able to have a political say, right?
Yeah, I mean, if anything, what strikes me about this is that I think some version, without, maybe a non-racist version, or certainly at least a less openly racist version of Buckley's argument, has been resuscitated in the last few years by liberals and by Never Trump conservatives, because if you remember, like after Donald Trump was elected, there was this whole spate of articles that would all like quote Plato on the dangers of demagogues winning in democratic systems, and basically suggest that the problem with Trump was too much democracy. That was like a pretty common theme. And I remember one thing that I thought was very interesting at the time. You can actually watch the very first political YouTube video I was ever in was in 2018. I spoke at the responding to Jordan Peterson conference in Ohio, and at the end of the talk, you can hear well, you don't see them, but you can hear their voices, both our friends Derek Varn and our late friend Michael Brooks in the Q&A. And one thing we were talking about in the Q&A was in terms of thinking about like the sort of legitimate anxieties and alienation that drive people to sell what Peterson is buying, and we were talking about how there were even people, well, actually in Buckley's magazine, appropriately enough, the National Review, like Kevin D. Williamson, who after the election, they sort of went on this tear of attacking what they saw as these like dumb white working class people in West Virginia or wherever who'd voted for Trump. Mm-hmm. And in sort of much the same way that conservatives have always talked about black people, that the reason there's all this poverty in Appalachia or the former coal country or whatever isn't because of any sort of structural thing that we should solve. It's because of like bad cultural values, which is like that's also, for example, what Hillbilly Elegy is entirely about. So I mean, I think in a way that move that Buckley makes at the end of the debate towards saying, "Oh, I'm not racist," I just have contempt for poor people in general, is kind of like I think has gotten an afterlife both among Buckley at conservatives, like these National Review Never Trumpers, but also also among some liberals. Like I'm thinking also of like after the election when Hillary said that, yeah, exactly. Thomas Frank has written a lot about this. That after the election, when Hillary said that, "Oh, I won in all of like the successful parts of the country," that like there's that same kind of suggestion that the people who should really technocratically count, are the ones who strove and went to college and succeeded, and that everybody else is just some sort of reprobate loser. And so I think that the part of Buckley's argument that seems the most dated is the part where he's tying it pretty explicitly to race, but the part that sort of I don't want to say it exactly holds up, but the part that seems depressingly familiar is the sort of general culturalist explanation of poverty for everybody. You have been watching free public content from Give Them an Argument. To access every single episode of the show, the main show on Monday nights, all of the streams, all of the debate breakdowns, all of the patron-exclusive postgames on Monday nights, all of the patron-exclusive bonus episodes every week, and much, much more, go to patreon.com/Ben Burgis. I cannot resist ending this with, don't be foolish.